Right. So I want to go back to disaster recovery. You mentioned SRM a little bit ago. Well, another thing that VMware showed off in this VMC presentation was disaster recovery as a service. And that was effectively SRM. And what they demoed was in their disaster recovery as a service, a platform with a whole bunch of automated runbooks to deal with your disaster recovery scenario. And they gave this a specific demo of, you've got a bunch of stuff running in New York, and you've got a bunch of other stuff in Tokyo just kind of sitting there waiting to be used. Not an active, but like an active passive data center sort of a design, which that's a whole other show, Ned. We can talk about the merits of active versus active passive and so on. But
Yes.
But if we just pause there for a minute, the scenario in which VMware presented this was, when you have disaster recovery assets that are sitting out there not doing much for you because you're not processing on them, because they're your disaster recovery scenario, you're trying to minimize your spend on that. You want to have as few compute assets sitting out there costing you money as possible while still having effective disaster recovery. And they made the point, okay, so with our disaster recovery as a service, we help you with that. You've got another site, it's sitting there, but you've spun down basically everything. When you have a disaster recovery event, then we're going to begin spinning things up to react to that disaster scenario. So site A goes down, site B then comes up. And it worked real slick in the demo and in PowerPoint. It was lovely.
Wait,
but
a demo worked really slick in a PowerPoint? That's
I know,
shocking. Frankly, who could have predicted?
So here's the thing about a service like this to me, Ned, is when you are designing for a disaster recovery situation, you have to have your runbooks very correct. And there's two phases to it to me. One is the failover to your disaster recovery site and bring up services live and having that all work. That's phase one. That's a thing you can automate, basically all of that. But what happens when it's time to fail back to your primary site? And this is where I think some folks fall short. In fact, there was some back channel chatter among some of the Cloud Field Day 7 delegates, and someone said, yeah, I know someone who built a disaster recovery scenario where it was all automated and site A went down, site B failed over, it was lovely, then site A came back up while site B was still up, and all hell broke loose. Yeah, it was ugly. So
you get into the split brain scenario if site A comes up automatically and starts trying to process transactions or advertise services, and those services are currently running in site B, then you get that conflict of who is picking up the thing, and they're fighting with each other, and you may lots of bad things can happen. So yes.
And if you're running stretched layer 2, where you've got the same IP address space going between site A and site B, it's potentially an astonishing nightmare, because now it's not just DNS conflicts at that point. Now you've got the same devices on the wire contending to be the responder to a query, and you'll have all kinds of data corruption and traffic tromboning and weird potential things that can happen. That's just, you're not going to be processing traffic effectively, that's for sure. Now, none of this, by the way, was a criticism of the VMware's disaster recovery as a service offering here. More, when you're using tools that are doing a heavy amount of automation, you need to think through the scenario forwards and backwards and have a regular test plan that validates that this disaster recovery and the runbooks as written are still working. So quarterly, I used to work for a company that we did that quarterly, what our disaster recovery scenario. And that was necessary, because almost every quarter it would be some little thing where it's like, oh, this was almost all working, but we forgot, oh, that's right, we stood up that new thing and forgot to make the mirrored DNS entries or whatever it was. And if you don't do that and you just think, oh yeah, I'm paying for that service, I'm sure it'll be fine, it's not going to be fine.
It's no. The time to test your DR service is not during a disaster.
Right.
Bad idea in general. And you were certainly in the minority of how companies do testing. When I was still working in consulting, I helped put together a solution offering around disaster recovery that we offered out to clients as a service. And it was primarily around planning for people and process. We were pretty agnostic around the tooling. Bring whatever disaster recovery solution you want. Our whole value was, okay, we need to plan this out. We need to actually have runbooks that work, and we need to set up a process where you are planning this on a regular where you're running it on a regular basis, failover and failback. It has to happen. You got to do both. And every company we talk to would be like, yeah, we do DR testing once a year. And I'm like, the thing that I always went back to, because, running, is I said, what if I told you that I need you to run a marathon tomorrow without any training? Would you make it through? Like, you might, but you would be a disaster. And if you look at people who come out of a DR exercise after 3 days, that's what they look like.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't you rather they do the training throughout the year, and then when they actually have to do the thing, they're prepared for it and they aren't complete wrecks?
Well, that's the thing. People think disaster recovery is so disruptive. I don't want to do that testing. It's like, hey, wait a minute. The whole point of disaster recovery is business continuity, right? You don't want it to be disruptive. You want it to be something you're so skilled at and so competent with and comfortable with and knowledgeable about, that when you face a disaster, it just happens and business continues on. That's the whole idea. So if you're not testing because you're scared of it, oh man, you really don't want a disaster, do you?
No, you don't.